Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Dadge. I am the spokesperson for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Let me welcome you to this press conference for the 6th session of the Conference of States Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption. Allow me to introduce the two participants. First of all, we have the Minister of Justice for the Russian Federation, Alexander KONOVALOV. Second, Under-Secretary General Yury FEDOTOV, the Executive Director of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. There are actually two elements to this press conference. First of all, I will ask the participants to make an opening statement, and then we will have a Q&A session. During the Q&A session, please could I ask you to state your name and also your media organization as well. We also have interpretation for this press conference, therefore statements and questions can be made in English or Russian. I'm rather ashamed to tell you that I shall be remaining monolingual and in English, unfortunately. However, let's begin. Minister of Justice KONOVALOV, please could I ask you to make your statement.
Большое спасибо. Как вы знаете, только что...
Thank you very much. As you know, we have just opened the 6th session of the Conference of State Parties of the UN Convention Against Corruption. Russia has received this right at the last conference in Marrakesh on the initiative of the Russian Federation. We were granted this right, and in accordance with the usual approach of the United Nations, this possibility is given to a country whose activity in anti-corruption measures is seen by the organization as being at a rather high level and conforming to UN standards. So for the Russian Federation, it's very important to have this opportunity. We had a national organizing committee, which I headed for the past year and a half, and we worked rather actively. Right now we have just 1 week for work of this organizing committee. We think that all the necessary conditions for the work of delegations, experts, guests of this session have been created, and everybody has everything necessary to work. There is no need to say that corruption today has become an absolutely transnational phenomenon, as most types of organized crime, and therefore fighting corruption should also be of an organized and coordinated nature and also be international. The Russian Federation is considering the United Nations, including this convention and the conference established for the implementation of the convention as the most adequate and contemporary and effective organization for fighting corruption. At every stage of the convention, in terms of finding criminals, seizing illegal assets, and the Russian Federation is cooperating and is prepared to continue to cooperate with all the participants of the convention and all international organizations. As usual, the session of the conference would consider a number of agenda items. In Panama, at the last session, the agenda was not adopted, but thanks to the consultations in Vienna, we were able to reach agreement on the agenda, and today, at the beginning of the plenary session, it was adopted by consensus. On the whole, all the decisions at the session are taken by consensus, so we think it very important to keep this balanced, comprehensive approach to considering various agenda items. One of the important items in the agenda is summarizing the results of the implementation review and starting the second round of such a review. The priority theme for the conference proposed by the Russian Federation, this is the right that the host has, is the interaction of the government and private sector in fighting corruption. This theme was one of the major subjects in international cooperation in fighting corruption at the last meeting in Panama 2 years ago, and the Russian Federation traditionally pays a lot of attention to this subject, so we thought it quite useful to consider this issue as a priority. Usually, we'll have 33 special events, or side events, if you will, on the margins of the conference, where various organizations, including non-governmental organizations, will present their approaches and their programs in fighting corruption. 2 of those events are presented by the Russian organizations, the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Ombudsman. Altogether, we're planning that about 1,500 people will participate, 6 government organizations and about 87 non-governmental organizations. And of course, throughout the conference, the organizing committee will work and do everything necessary so that the participants can work with comfort. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister KONOVALOV. Mr. Fedotov, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, David. I just looked across this list of participants, and it seems to me that it would be more natural if I try to speak Russian, if you don't mind. There are exclusively Russian names, except few.
Thank you, Mr. Fedotov. I have translation for myself, so thank you.
Thank you for your understanding.
First of all, I would like to use this opportunity once again to say on behalf of the UN, on behalf of the UNODC, to convey condolences in connection with the tragic air crash over the Sinai Peninsula. We have felt in your hospitable city how much and with such pain this tragedy is felt, so I would like to express my condolences once again to the families of those who died. Let me also use this opportunity to thank the Russian Federation and the government of the Russian Federation, the Ministry of Justice, and personally to the Minister of Justice, Alexander Konovalov, for hospitality and for the organization of this very important conference in the Russian Federation, and also for the permanent support of international effort aimed at fighting corruption politically, morally, in terms of providing ideas and subjects for discussions, and also, which is very important, as regards logistics and finance. Yes, indeed, we have a very serious challenge here. Corruption, the scale of corruption is trillions of dollars. This is a very serious portion in the world product. Just one example. The developing countries lose $40 billion annually as a result of corruption. This is funds which are being stealed, and they cannot be used any longer for schools, hospitals, roads. This is the funds which are very often used by transnational organized crime. The unique nature of the St. Petersburg conference is quite clear. The General Secretary of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, sent a greeting to the conference. By the way, this is the first such message from the Secretary General in the history of the 6th sessions of conferences of state parties. Why has this happened? First of all, the conference takes place 1 month since the end of the Global Summit in New York in September, which adopted an ambitious new program for sustainable development up to 2030. The program includes 17 main goals for sustainable development, and those goals are comprehensive. This is not only economic or social development goals, but also goals which have to do with the strengthening legal order, fighting crime. In particular, Goal 16 provides for increasing efforts to eliminate corruption, bribery in all their forms. The UNODC is a structure of the UN Secretariat which assists states in implementing those and other goals, and we intend to work ever more actively. Secondly, the conference, as the minister has said, which will mean a transfer from the first cycle to the second as regards the implementation mechanism. What does it mean? The UNCAC is a unique international convention because it provides for a clear mechanism for verifying its implementation as a universal comprehensive review held periodically. In this sense, all states are equal and they report to each other how they fulfill the main provisions of the convention. During the first stage, the review was held of provisions on criminalization and international cooperation. From now on, we will be talking about international cooperation in the sphere of preventing corruption and the return of assets, which also has to do with prevention, because if corrupt people will know that the funds they have stolen will be returned, they will not have the impetus to engage in corruption. So at this conference, we will be working on the modalities for reviewing the implementation of these provisions of the convention. The third important factor at this conference is that currently, we see the growing threat of organized crime, money laundering, and corruption, and joining hands with terrorism and militant extremism. Very often, terrorist groups use corruption schemes to launder money and to finance their activity. Therefore, the task is on the basis of a comprehensive approach to work out such mechanisms and forms which will help in solving this problem and help in overcoming it. The conference is to take a number of important decisions. It has a very diverse subjects. We will be discussing strengthening cooperation and partnership between the government and the private sector in preventing and fighting corruption, more effective use of civil and administrative procedure, the return of stolen assets, prevention of corruption using information technologies, the side events held on the margins of the conference will also be devoted to discussing subjects concerning the prevention of corruption in fighting crimes against nature, wild nature, or illegal trafficking of stolen cultural heritage, increasing the role of the private sector and the youth in fighting corruption, fighting corruption and bribery in terms of supporting the Global Development Agenda until 2030, and many other items. Well, throughout these 5 days, we will work actively, intensively. Our office performs the functions of the secretariat of the conference. Our task is to support the representatives of the delegations, which are quite numerous. You know that 177 states participate in the convention. It's nearly universal, and we think that 150 states are represented at this conference. Many ministers, prosecutors, heads of national services for fighting corruption, and so on. Therefore, we have every ground to believe that the conference will be successful and that its results will continue to make us more confident that sooner or later we'll be able to defeat corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. We now move into the question and answer section. Once again, please could I ask you to state your names, but also your media organizations. Now, who wants to ask the first question? The lady at the back, do you have access to a microphone?
Yes, I do. My name is Anna. I'm a reporter with Sputnik International News Agency. Mr. Fedotov, you've just mentioned that many terrorist organizations are using corruption in order to launder money. Could you please describe how exactly this works?
Okay. That is also important issue, which underscores the need of more efforts in terms of research and analysis. Unfortunately, our database is insufficient to make more or less definitive conclusions. We have information, for instance, that many terrorist and extremist organizations not only using the same routes and the same tools as criminal groups involved in drug trafficking, but sometimes they're involved directly in these activities. For instance, we know that Boko Haram in Nigeria and West Africa is involved in illicit drug trafficking and kidnapping for ransoms. We know less about Middle East, ISIL, but it is clear that ISIL is involved at least in smuggling of oil, in smuggling of cultural property, as well as trafficking in precursors to produce drugs, which Captagon, which can be used also to generate more benefits for them. And there are many other links. Speaking about extremism, we're also aware that every year Taliban get from illicit drug trafficking up to $200 million US. And of course, to get sometimes for terrorist and extremist organization, organized criminal assets could be the only so to say, financial, the only budget. And all these assets are being used, and to use them, they need to launder this and to illicit financial flows are important supporters of violent extremism and terrorism. Those days in New Delhi, UNODC supports an international conference precisely to discuss illicit financial flows in support of organized crime and terrorism and violent extremism. And I hope that with support of member states, with support with other UN and international agencies, we could achieve more and we could have a broader picture of this situation. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fedotov. Justice Minister KONOVALOV, do you perhaps have a comment on that? No? Okay. I will move. Any further questions? The lady at the front in the dress.
Агентство РИА Новости, Анжелика Болмат. У меня вопрос к Александру Владимировичу.
News agency Novosti. Do you think we have to make the stricter laws considering the safety of the airline flights, considering the last Egyptian catastrophe?
Наверное, было бы неправильно.
Thank you for your question. It would be wrong to ignore this tragic issue. Of course, it's not concerned by our conference, and our laws consider these things, and of course they consider the issue of threats, and we have some tragic basis to consider this. And of course, we have to give some legal answers to these questions. The issue of guilt, if we find guilty people in this tragedy, and further, we will have to consider if we think that this tragedy is a result of the legal lacuna or some legal practice. Sometimes we tend to answer the questions changing our laws, doing this hastily without thinking how we can apply these laws. That's why the answers have to be weighted and rational. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Minister. Any other questions? The lady in black at the front. Thank you.
Газета «Коммерсант», Анна Пушкова.
Kommersant newspaper. A question to Alexander Vladimirovich. Which NGOs in Russia and in the world are the most effective in the fight against corruption? And how do you interact with them? Second question. What do you think about the law which introduces responsibility for concealing the information from the owners of real estate? What do you think about this law and how it will be reflected in the fight against corruption? Thank you very much. Considering the NGOs that are fighting corruption, the Russian Federation, as you know, during this session of the conference is represented by 10 of such NGOs, and this reflects the real situation and importance of this question in the civil society. Those who wanted to do that has the possibility to represent our society in considering the issue of corruption in the country. About the foreign NGOs or international organizations, we could mention Transparency International. This is the most important organization that specializes in all segments of the fight against corruption, especially those that I mentioned before, talking about the main segments of the convention, of the UN Convention. This is prevention and persecution and return of the stolen assets. Of course, we have cooperation in the margin of in the framework of the organizations and international organizations, GRECO, UEFA, UN, of course, and we are trying to attract non-governmental organizations, including foreign organizations. I know that the direct dialogue with the foreign organizations, with the foreign NGOs that specialize in the fight against corruption is realized by our NGOs. We consider this experience. At the Presidential Council Against Corruption, we have a specialized working group that maintains contacts with civil society and NGOs, of course, were very grateful and very attentive to the practices that are mentioned on during this conference, and will be using these approaches in the future. About the second question, unfortunately, I have not in details studied this issue, and I cannot comment on it as a legal specialist. And this is just your idea about the disclosure of the information about the real estate ownership. This idea has to be materialized first, and I cannot, as a legal specialist, give some comments on this issue. Speaking in abstract, I can say that the information from the should be received by the civil society, and this is the question of the limits of this information and the limits of penetrating of any person who wishes that into the private information. This is the issue of private protection, private information. Of course, sometimes issues of real estate ownership are connected with the personal safety of some people, and we have to balance those issues, and we have to determine them from the point of view of their correspondence to the needs of the society. Of course, such laws must exist, and the representative of experts and civil society must participate in their development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Minister KONOVALOV. Any further questions? The lady with the cardigan.
Two issues, two questions. TASS agency. First, how can you estimate the damage from corruption for Russia? And another question about Egypt. Does Russia prepare the order to return the black boxes from the air flight for aircraft? On the second issue, I will tell you that in such situation, the people who are responsible for this start to work immediately. This is a specialized organization that controls airlines, air transport, and the Committee for Investigations of the Russian Federation. You can ask them about the damage from corruption. I'm afraid I will not be able to give an exact figure because we can measure it differently. There are different methods of calculating these figures, and of course we can say that it's not a small amount. It will be different considering the methodology of calculation. What is the direct damage? Is it the volume of assets or stolen budget funds? What can we consider? Say, can we consider the damage by NGOs? I've got different figures, and there were volumes that can be compared with the annual GNP, say 10–20% from GNP of the Russian Federation. Of course, we cannot say that this is an exact figure, but of course it can cause our concern. And of course, we should base ourselves not on the figures. We have to consider the unacceptable character of this issue. Corruption is a British term. It's like rust, like damage to the social process of the society. It's one of the dramatic ways to damage the social situation that forms a very wrong and very sick relationship within the political, humanitarian, and social systems. Now, we are standing in front of the financial crisis, and probably we are forming new geopolitical relations and maybe considering new approaches in the relations between the countries, developing their societies, and of course this kind of distortion is not acceptable. We cannot accept the corruption, and Russia does not accept it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Minister. Any additional questions? Please, the gentleman with the blue shirt. Do we have a microphone, perhaps, for him? Or thank you very much.
У меня тоже вопрос к министру Коновалову. Меня зовут Артем Алексеевич.
I have a question to Minister KONOVALOV, Business News Agency. In Russia, we have lots of organizations and funds and reporters that realize their own investigation into corruption. And sometimes the stories are very loud. The watch of Mr. Peskov, the ownership property of Minister of Defense, and this information comes to the media, but there is no official investigation. Nobody says that we checked those facts, they're not true, or they are true. This is just ignored. Why does it happen, and can we change it? Thank you for your question. I cannot probably answer on behalf of those structures that must realize such investigation and that did not do that, and who did not inform journalists about the results. In our ministry, we do not do such investigations about specific issues. We do not have any right of persecution or organization of investigations. I can confirm, and you are right, that the information in the media is by its nature is an application or information about the crimes that are committed or are prepared to be committed. Of course, such information must be verified by the official organs, and there is a responsibility for refusing to verify such information or reject the further investigation. That's why I can mention those laws, and you have all the laws to state your point of view and insist on its investigation. I have 13 years experience of work in the prosecutor's office. Without commenting specific cases, I can say that there is a certain lack of information. There is a wide territory lacuna between the version of the journalists or operative information when police has information about specific persons, and the results of this investigation and the indictment of the court. We know that such indictment is supposed to be based on the specific facts, on the proofs that are accepted by the law. And here, not always the primary information can be proven or confirmed in the form that it would be acceptable by the court. Sometimes operative or fast investigations about murders or corruptions or bribery cannot be considered by the court because police cannot prove them. So this is the way I can answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister of Justice. I think we have time for one further question, and then we can probably conclude this press conference. I will take a question from the lady in black again who held her hand up, and that will be the last question. Thank you.
Спасибо. У меня еще два вопроса.
Спасибо. I think I have two questions about corruption. First of all, about the independent expertise, which is organized by Ministry of Justice. You have a list of experts, but some of them say that this work is not very effective, and they cannot reach a result of the certain expert actions. I would like to ask you, how effective is the result of those of the work of those experts, and how active it is being realized with the accredited experts? And the second question is connected with this topic. Now in the Constitutional Court, we have several cases about the complaints of the lawyers on some very big cases. Some lawyers sometimes have to swear that they will not give the information about investigation, and they are controlled by investigators. And the prosecutor's office on the case of Serdukov and Govorugin, chief of the St. Petersburg subway, provokes lots of comments, and people do their opinion about the corruption, etc. How balanced is this situation? How can we regulate it? Thank you very much for your questions. Yes, you're right. The state registry for independent expert has about 2,000 names, and this work is realized by physical and legal entities, and we consider this work to be very important for the general politics against corruption. It's of course not ideal, and it's not even approaching the ideal. And I would agree with you that the potential of this methodology is not used to the fullest extent. And of course, I can take a part of the guilt on my ministry. We sometimes are not reacting actively or fail to react to the comments of the experts. Sometimes we just do not support the opinion of such an expert. Of course, we respond to him, but we do not support his opinion. And of course, we have some bureaucracy in our ministry, of course, but I must say that very often the opinions of the experts have the character of somewhat not being far from reality. And sometimes, unfortunately, we can say it about a lot of cases. They are often emotional. They have general opinion, and they do not have too much legal material in them. And I'm very upset about the fact that we cannot, to the fullest, use the important resource of the civil society. And I'm not satisfied that this initiative, this social approach, social need, is not always having a legal format. And this is our problem. The participation of the civil society has lots of emotions, political issues, and the practical side is very small. And this information sometimes is not taking the specific legal framework which can help indict the people who are guilty, who break the law. And I would be very happy if the independent experts would be more specific in their legal activity. We can strengthening the dialogue. Those frameworks are very important. I mentioned the group with the Presidium of the Presidential Council Against Corruption, and we think there are other approaches, social society activity, for example. You asked about it in your first part of your question, say the NGOs that are fighting corruption. This dialogue will help us estimate the effectiveness of the experts. We can give some advice or some proposals to improve those results. About the judicial practice, this possibility, of course, is not an absolute evil. For me, for functionary and for a legal specialist, law is law, and it can be and must exist. We do not have xenophobic laws or some evil laws in the Russian Federation. Of course, the issue sometimes is the judicial practice when investigators can abuse the limitation of the lawyers' activity for disclosing the information they try to use as witnesses, and they cannot participate in the legal defense. Of course, such cases can exist. I cannot commend them. I do not do it directly, and I cannot give you examples of the cases, but of course we must base ourselves on the judicial practice and specific cases. Any lawyer which has all qualifications must be an active professional that defends its reputation and professional point of view, and it can protest the investigators' decisions in the law, in the court of law. And if he does not do it, this probably a lack of activity or maybe failing to fulfill his duties. We should use it, and we should consider the decisions of the court. Considering the investigators, I cannot comment on this, cannot answer this question because they are not my subordinates. I cannot say what do they comment on, what decisions they take, but as an ordinary citizen, of course, I can say that the two prolific commentaries on not finalized cases, which are not considered by court, cannot be acceptable, especially when I worked in the prosecutor's office. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister of Justice KONOVALOV. That ends this press conference. I'd like to thank very much the speakers. I would like to thank Yevgeny and Igor, whom a warm personal thanks for doing the translation, the interpretation today, and also thanks to the journalists and also to the UN Information Service for actually putting together this press conference in the first place. Thank you.